Thank you, Zita. That's a beautiful, rich, textured view about the role of community, and I think a good starting point for our discussion. I'll now bring in the other panelists, and we'll get to the Q&A, including from the audience. Let me introduce you to Alex Leblanc. Alex is presently the executive director of the New Brunswick Multicultural Council, and he brings with him a long record of involvement in the nonprofit sector, including with the Tim Hortons Children's Foundation, the New Brunswick Association for Community Living, and various other ways in which he's active in New Brunswick, with a particular focus on attracting, integrating, and retaining newcomers to participate in the economy. Thank you so much for being with us today, Alex. Secondly, welcome to Annika Voltan. Annika is the executive director at a nonprofit organization in Halifax called Inspiring Communities. Annika's been there since 2016 in supporting the strategic operations of the organization, with a particular focus on building collaborative relationships within the region. And Annika has a PhD in social entrepreneurship, which I think is a great example of how our education system is really increasingly geared and focused on bottom-up community engagement. And lastly, we have Geoffrey Mctavish. Geoffrey is presently the Director of Economic Development and Tourism for the city of Miramich. And similarly, he brings a rich record of involvement in the for-profit and nonprofit and governmental world to his work in supporting economic development and tourism in Miramich, and of course having insights about the opportunities and challenges facing the region. So thanks to each of you. We have a bit of time here to both. I have some questions for you, and I think we'll have plenty from the audience, particularly after Zita's thoughtful remarks. Maybe I'll open it up with a question to each of you. Alex, why don't we start with you? Zita talked a bit about the tensions between big and small, local and global, region and community. And so as we think about economic development in the short term in the context of COVID-19 and in the long term, how should those in the world of public policy and those listening to our discussion today think about those tensions, and how do we enable and support communities to do the kind of bottom-up development that Zita is talking about?
Great question, Sean. Very big question, but I'll try to take a stab at it. Thanks again to the Public Policy Forum for the invitation to participate. I think, like I underlined when Zita was speaking about making the local global, and there's no more concrete example of that than the numbers of people coming from the global community to our region. Over the last number of years, immigration has contributed in such enormous ways to our economic growth, but also to enriching communities. And I think this question about what is the right policy instrument for regions versus local communities is a really big one. So there are examples of really good policy that make a concrete difference for regions. The Atlantic Immigration Pilot introduced a number of years ago. Before, in 2015, we had 8,500 newcomers come to our region. And flash forward just 4 years, 17,875 newcomers came to our region. So the AIP is an example of a policy instrument that was tailored for the region's needs. It produced a significant turnaround in terms of our population growth and immigration work. And so I think this is specifically the area that I'm most interested in.
Annika, do you want to answer that as well?
So again, it's a big question. This how can we think local, regional, global, and have this kind of multi-layered systems lens? And maybe I'll give an example from our work. So
Right.
Inspiring Communities is a relatively new organization, and one of our first kind of major projects that we got involved with is developing these locally community-based initiatives built on the principles of collective impact and asset-based community development, which Zita was speaking to. And really, there was a deputy minister who was involved in getting this going. And I remember she said, we need to move away from this spray and pray approach to policy making. So this idea that it's a one size fits all approach, that often it's centrally made, and then we put it out there and hope that something sticks and that change is made. And a lot of the time, what we're seeing, especially on the most complex social and environmental challenges of our time, is that things are getting worse. And so the thinking here was, can we flip the way that we work and the relationships that we have so that, to this idea of the third pillar, government, business, and community are working together at the same table in partnership. And so using these principles, it's, community knows best. Community knows where the priorities are locally. We can bring people together to put, different skills and perspectives around those issues. And then the interesting thing about how Inspiring Communities has been set up is that we have these initiatives which look really different because they're different contexts in Cape Breton, one in a more urban environment in Dartmouth, and then one in Digby. But we also have this kind of network approach. So there's almost a backbone of backbones, so that the learning that's happening at the local level can be shared with other learning in other communities. And we can identify where there might be common thematic issues that could affect, in this case, provincial policy change. That doesn't mean that the policies are universal and look the same everywhere, but that we can learn at that local level to affect the provincial level. We're increasingly trying to build relationships and networks at the Atlantic region level. And I think participating in more national conversations to really highlight the amazing community work that is here.
That's great. Geoffrey, do you want to take a stab at this question as well? And maybe if you can, as part of your answer, maybe talk a bit about how you think the COVID-19 experience may change the way in which we think local, regional, and ultimately global.
Yeah, so I mean, working in a small rural municipality in New Brunswick, northern New Brunswick at that, we are where that rubber hits the road. So, we talk about global, federal, provincial, regional, and then land in Miramich. So we've had some examples where we've seen policies that were made provincially, and then the nice thing is that I think even as a provincial government, our government recognized that there is no cookie cutter approach. So they've asked our local communities to develop plans that work for them. Alex can kind of validate this, that one of the Made in Miramich solutions that we've done has to do with population growth. So it was grassroots. It didn't start at the municipal level. It started at the Multicultural Association. It started at community college levels. It started at our business levels, all experiencing similar challenges, either trying to retain people, find places for them to live, or find employees for their businesses. And together, they came together, developed a plan. They approached the municipality, wanted their support, because traditionally that's not been our area of expertise or our area of responsibility. So we've been asked to now contribute to those types of initiatives. And I believe that our council is going to bring that forward. It will become a municipal mandate. And we will be working in conjunction with folks like Alex at the provincial level, and also hopefully federally, to try to get some support to bring new people to Miramich.
That's great. I'm struck as each of you discussed your roles and your perspectives of something Premier King said, which when we're focused on community, we're able to personalize these issues. We're not in a world of abstraction, and I think what you all have said in your own way is that one of the benefits of a community orientation is that we can focus on real people and real circumstances, and I think that's a tremendous strength that you have in Atlantic Canada, and one that we could draw on the rest of the country. Zita, before I turn to some of the other questions, do you want to just comment on what you heard and so far, and how it relates to your own thoughts and comments?
Yeah, I think just listening to Alex and Geoffrey and Annika is exactly I could give examples from Fogo Island of the things that they were saying as well. And I think it's this question that we're all grappling with a little bit is, how does the part belong to the whole? How does a community, big or small, belong to its region? How does it belong to its nation? How does it belong to its global? And I think Annika said it well, that it's how you use your networks. And I mean, we gathered here on this call, like I'm writing down things because I'm going to be sending you all emails after, because we are part of a network and I can learn from each and every one of you. I already have. And I need to take that home and figure out, what does that mean in my local? I think what we need are more coherent platforms for architectures for us to come together around these questions of economic development, community economic development. I would like to see that in Atlantic Canada, we become, why can't we be leaders in showing how asset-based community development methodologies work? They're practical. You can go through a process, Geoffrey, in your home, and I can go through one in mine. The methodology would be the same. We likely would come up with a very different answer. I think that's the piece that is missing, is how, because otherwise we come together in conferences and it all gets lost, and maybe I remember something and Alex remembers something. But I think it's making the networks work for the locals. But we have to start with to optimize for the locals. That's the lens we have to grow.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Alex, you talked in your first answer about the work that you're doing to attract and retain newcomers, again, using a bottom-up approach, a holistic, community-oriented approach. Do you want to just talk a bit about your model, and in general, and in particular, how you and your team are thinking about your activities in the context of COVID-19 and what may follow?
Yeah, so Geoffrey was referring to kind of some of the work that stemmed out of a community engagement we did in Miramich in 2018 for the New Conversations tour. And that was a tour to 15 communities to discuss demographics, the economy, and the role that immigration will hopefully play in kind of providing new life and new energy to our communities. And so following that meeting, we came in, and in many of those small communities, mayors and local governments didn't really see it as their role to either attract or welcome people. It was seen as a provincial jurisdiction or a federal jurisdiction, but that wasn't ultimately getting the results that they wanted to see. They wanted to have a growing, thriving community. So what we saw following that was Mayor Lorden in Miramich said, this is now one of his top priorities, and he's been really championing it. And as a result, Miramich led the per capita immigration rates in New Brunswick last year. So they really, they're on fire. And just a nice story as well about what that actually looks like in real terms. Miramich just hosted a dialogue involving the mayor, involving Black residents, involving the Multicultural Association, I think it was yesterday, and it was a very profound conversation, a reflection on systemic racism and the experiences that people are having in their communities. And you know, it's not just about wanting people to fill gaps in our labor market. It's about having platforms so that you can have, you know, genuine and open conversations and listen to people and their experiences. So, I mean, the mayor said, I don't think our community would have been in a place to have a conversation like this 5 years ago, but because they've kind of adopted it as their mission and one of his number one priorities, he's making conversations and a priority. And it kind of touches on what Zita's saying, is how do we create those spaces for that kind of learning and evolution as communities grow?
That's great. Geoffrey, I'd be remiss if I didn't let you maybe comment on that, given that it sounds like you and your team are on fire, as Alex says. Maybe talk a bit about your efforts to cultivate newcomers to Miramich and northern New Brunswick, and more generally, how you're thinking about economic development, the role of markets, the role of business, the role of government, as has been said, the three pillars of a community-oriented economic development strategy.
Well, thank you, Sean. And Alex, I cannot take credit for the work that is being done. That work is really community driven. That is the business community. That is the non-for-profit groups. That is the citizens of this area really driving those initiatives. Our role as, and I know it was previously defined, but if you want to look at us as a government, our role has been to support that. So whether it's financially or through, you know, connections that we might have to get them into the ears of the proper bureaucrats or politicians, that's been our role. And again, as a mayor and council, we have a great support. And Alex is bang on. 5 years ago, I don't know if people, if the people changed or the conversation changed. That's the big thing. And people weren't scared to have that conversation anymore. People saw that businesses were struggling to find, you know, skilled labor, and there were people that were unwilling to take those particular positions. So there needed to be some type of solution for that problem. And immigration has been a conversation that we've heard, you know, across Atlantic Canada, definitely for the last 5 years with Frank McKenna or you know, some of those you know, big names in Atlantic Canada speaking out on top of it. We as a community recognized that need and then started to look at what some of our shortcomings were. So we've got our first housing needs assessment strategy taking place, because much like the conversation that the Premier was having about the vacancy rate in Prince Edward Island, ours has been hovering between 0 and 2% for 10 years. So the investment's not coming on the housing side, which really can restrict the amount of people that we can welcome to our community. On a more macro level, we've also initiated a strategic planning exercise that incorporates the population growth so that it becomes part of my mandate in economic development tourism. The tourism strategy itself, how we're going to market our region. And, you know, when you define the community there, it's not just the city of Miramich, it's all the businesses that support this ecosystem. So, you know, we've got some great work going on. The COVID has slowed down some of those industries or sectors that we're focusing on. However, it gives us the time that we really needed to get our planning done and get all of our ducks lined up before we can actually get those promotions started and really try to attract those investments.
That's great. Thank you. Now, Annika, can you please, for those who are listening who may not be familiar with Inspiring Communities, can you tell us a bit more about your model? And as someone in Central Canada, what are some of the lessons that can be learned from your successes in communities who may be facing similar circumstances or have similar conditions, not just in Atlantic Canada, but across the country?
Sure. And I want to make sure as well that I really underscore what Zita said about the potential for us in Atlantic Canada to be leaders in this area of asset-based community development. So I really believe that to be true. I think we're all familiar with the phrase of being a set of have-not provinces or region. And I think in an area that we have a lot of abundance is around social capital and the value of community and relationships and showing up and helping our neighbors. And so I think in terms of the work that I was talking about, so we Inspiring Communities has these three really place-based community initiatives. And more, I think we're looking at how can we help to create the conditions in the space for this kind of network platform of sharing learning with each other about what it is to work with more of a systems change lens, working in complex adaptive systems to, you know, not treat problems in silos, to think about what the effects are from multiple levels and across multiple policy domains. And that is our work falls under three main pillars. So the first is really kind of, we call it nesting, but it's this idea of enabling experimentation, because we're all very familiar and it's socially accepted to have R&D investments in the private sector, but it's less commonly spoken about in the social sector and in community building work. And the funding mechanisms that we have in place are often not geared to allow for space to take risks and just try things with the expectation that not everything is going to work. So we're providing more of this kind of back-end support so that, you know, if there's an idea that requires, you know, a learning environment, some back-end financial supports or admin supports or whatever, we can help it get off the ground. And then the other two areas around evaluation and learning. And so with evaluation, it's really, having credible research-based information to say, this is what might work. And I would welcome anyone who wants to learn more to go onto our website and explore the resources there in terms of what are the kinds of indicators, around relationship building, community building that we're seeing are looking promising. And then finally, around a learning pillar, somebody raised the point of needing more kind of platforms to connect. And that's something that we're actively working on, is just, spaces, yes, a lot of it online, but in-person gatherings as well, where we can host, whether they be one-off conversations or workshops or train the trainer kinds of tools, so that, maybe there's somebody in a very remote rural area that wants to build their capacity and facilitate community building conversations, but they just need access to those resources and tools to do that. So
that's great. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
No, it's inspiring work. We have quite a few questions from the audience, so maybe I'll turn to those for the time we have left. Zita, now you've mentioned in your remarks, and it's come up a couple of times in our conversation, the value of asset-based economic development. Do you mind just two things? First, elaborating a bit on what asset-based assessments are and the utility of such a model when thinking about community economic development, and then what steps, if any, can be taken from a policy perspective to enable or permit communities to follow the lead of you and the community of Fogo Island?
Maybe I will ground the answer in Fogo Island. And I learned about this work from, and I think one of the pioneers was a fellow named John McKnight, who was working in Chicago. And I actually attended some workshops. John is well into his 80s and still going strong. He said, I spent years and years and years working in communities in Chicago where we were trying to help people who were poor or uneducated or had ill health or whatever. And he said years and years went by, and I didn't get rich doing it, but I made a living. And after 20 years, I realized those people's lives haven't changed. And then he said, I had this sort of realization that the problem was we were focusing on what was wrong with them, not focusing on what was right with them. Mm. And so he said, nobody ever built a future based on what they don't know and don't have. So let's focus on assets. What do we know? We must know something. What do we have? And so to go to the Fogo Island work, when we started Shorefast, it was a dozen years ago now, and with this goal that we're going to put another leg on the economy based on community-based, profound hospitality start with a very high-end inn and a contemporary arts venue. People are like, this is a bald rock in the North Atlantic. Well, actually, it's more than a bald rock in the North Atlantic. And when you start to look at what's there with the eyes of what is here, what do people love, what do people value, you suddenly realize, well, it's actually not that hard a job for us to become the top rated property in the entire country, because we have everything, but only because we grew the eyes through this asset-based process of actually seeing what we have. And I want to come back to this local global, because we are trying to localize the global. It is about immigration, but it's about way more than immigration. Communities can be terribly self-canceling because, the weather is bad, or this is bad, or I never liked your grandmother, so I'm not going to work with you. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on in communities, especially small ones, that are not actually particularly productive. So I think in terms of a policy that we could adopt, it would be to let us actually build a platform to teach and practice and share what we are learning about how to do asset-based community development, because I think it brings people together in entirely different kinds of conversation, maybe same people, different eyes. But it's all about where we focus. And I mean, maybe the last thing I'll say about it is several of the people here have said, we work in silos so much that sometimes we forget what is the problem we're trying to solve. I mean, I remember in the very early days of our project when we realized, wow, we're going to need 250 people. And my younger brother said to me, I thought we were starting a project to create jobs, but those people aren't here. And so then we realized, oh, well, they actually are here. They happen to be in their 60s and 70s, and we have to get them back to work. But I just think we need a holistic approach to understanding what are the problems we're trying to solve. What are we trying to accomplish?
That's great. Geoffrey and Alex, maybe I'll put this question to you. It's an interesting one from the audience. Last week's session focused quite a lot on the attraction and retention of international students. And I know that both of you have talked about the important work that's being done in this regard in New Brunswick. But one of the audience members asks about the out-migration of people more generally from the region. Is there a different strategy in your mind for the retention of immigrants to the region versus the out-migration of people who may have been born in New Brunswick or other parts of Atlantic Canada? Or is there, how should policymakers or how should community members think about out-migration? Is it a different issue then? Does it require a different set of tools than the retention of immigrants, or is there a lot of overlap between the two? Geoffrey and Alex, do either of you want to comment on I think what is an interesting question?
Jeff, do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
You go ahead, Alex.
I look, I think it is an interesting question, but I also worry about the obsession with retention and keeping people in. I mean, Toronto proper has a higher out-migration than our province does in terms of percentage of population. Like, people will leave, people will move. I think that's something that we're seeing is much more common. Obviously, in the context of COVID, that's completely kind of changing, and who knows how long that or what the post-pandemic reality will be in terms of migration. But I think I think certainly in terms of creating opportunities for people generally is going to help with retention of both international students, immigrants, and New Brunswick-born population. But you do need different strategies if people are coming as immigrants without social networks, without kind of a knowledge of the local labor market, without just connections in general, family support systems. Then they will need different types of assistance to make connections and to really find the right opportunity in our region. So it does take different tools, in my opinion. But I think that the obsession with retention is I think also getting in our way. I think fundamentally what we need is just more tools like the Atlantic Immigration Pilot that enable us to bring people here. And as we start being more kind of exposed as an area of opportunity, and the Premier kind of underlined how tremendous this region is, and how this, what better time than any to really capitalize on the quality of life and our position in the world. And I think, so we just need more exposure, more visibility, and I think that the retention will start to fall in place. But it does require different tools, different instruments from a policy standpoint to facilitate that, in my opinion.
And Sean, on Alex's point, our committee, actually part of their population growth strategy does have a retained element to it. So their strategy seems to, in order to feel part of the community, you have to be involved in it. And there is an integration program that they have designed. So getting them, any newcomers involved in various elements of the community, whether it's from a volunteer point of view, whether it's from an organizing point of view, but allowing them to understand the culture of our community. And but again, we're in our building stages right now, and just as we saw some momentum, the world said, just everyone take a break for a little while. So it's going to allow us to really build the tools up to hopefully retain. And I think Alex can say that, Miramichi has seen a high retention rate as far as, any newcomers are concerned. But we want to continue that momentum, continue attracting people here, continue to retain them, and then allow them to grow in our community. That's
great. And Annika, you talked a bit about the social capital present in our communities, the extent to which that's a comparative advantage or a strength for Halifax or for Atlantic Canada or for Canada as a whole. I think, while we obviously have our challenges, and one doesn't want to diminish those. We're seeing the erosion of community in other countries around the world. How do we leverage the social capital or the community strengths that we have in order to bolster our communities, bolster our economy. Do you have any thoughts on that as a social entrepreneur? How to seize this opportunity we have to leverage the social capital that you and others are helping to cultivate?
Well, I think that much to what I was speaking before, there's an element of building awareness and capacity around this as well. And you mentioned social enterprise. I think that's there's still a ton of potential in that model, and thinking in a more entrepreneurial way in the community sector and in nonprofits around this idea of, what are the opportunities that we have right in front of us. We'll often talk about things like being really scrappy and being able to, make things happen with little resources. But there's also great potential in building, whether they be local businesses that can, strengthen that local economy. And I think sometimes we get distracted or obsessed with, big business, exports, tech sector. And, there's so much. You can look at like even the craft beer industry here that has had such a huge effect on drawing people to unlikely places and creating jobs. And, so thinking more about how can we use what we have close at hand, but then also develop the skills in the local workforce, and thinking beyond, I think, the conventional approaches to education. So the Premier talked a little bit about, just thinking about how do we do virtual learning, and that's one component, but also, stretching beyond the assumption that it needs to be through universities, for example, or that it's, needs to look a certain way. So I think if we can get this, and I would say too, like this abundance mentality is really in a lot of ways the opposite of scarcity, which is what we're so used to working in. It's just, I've got to preserve my piece of the pie because that's all I have, or, we're working with so little, versus let's pool what we have. It's kind of that stone soup analogy, if you've ever heard of it, and then we can make something greater by contributing all together.
That's great. Zita, I have to ask you a question. You're a social entrepreneur, but you're also a successful business person. Do you want to, and someone who's started a successful business in her community, one of the things that I've been grappling with in my own research is the question of the role of government versus the role of markets in community economic development. I think there's persuasive evidence that there is the market trend towards urban agglomeration for a whole host of reasons. And so what's the role of government in trying to push or prod or encourage investment to outside of major urban centers? Is there a role of government? Have you seen effective models that ought to be scaled up or adopted in Atlantic Canada or elsewhere in the country?
Can't say I can think of any models offhand that I think the Spanish Basques do all of this better than any of us. So I think there's lots to learn there. And certainly we've learned lots there because they fundamentally understand that their cultural assets and their economic assets are kind of the same. And cultural assets live in the places where people have enduring multi-century relationships with the natural world. If you just think about tourism, people come to Canada when they can come again, which hopefully will be soon, come to Canada, not that they don't want to don't want to go to Toronto, but I don't think mostly if you're coming as a visitor tourist to Canada, you came to only see Toronto. And if you look at tourism as an example, you can get to Toronto. Most of our tourism assets are in small, remote, deeply rich cultural places which are embedded in nature and have through whatever way they made a living over the centuries, have a lot of cultural learning. Some of them are indigenous communities, but you can't get there. And so at what time do we actually sit down as Canadians and go, okay, let's make a tourism plan for our country that looks at the issues holistically? And what are the problems we're trying to solve? Is it that if they go to Miramichi, there's actually nowhere for someone to stay? I don't know. Maybe there are lots of places. Maybe the people in Miramichi, I don't believe that entrepreneurs are like sent down from heaven in hoodies. Entrepreneurs are everywhere. But maybe the people in Miramichi who have ideas about how they want to host people haven't been able to find access to capital to do the development that they want to do. Maybe there's no flight to actually get there. And so I think we just need to take a very holistic approach. The other thing, back to infrastructure, that is basic infrastructure. The only communities that should not have high-speed internet are the ones, I said it earlier, we don't wish to keep. And so government has that responsibility to make sure that and I think we're working on it. That needs to go faster, because this local global, you can't belong to the global, because I said earlier, it's not just about immigration. It's about understanding what is going on in the world so that we can find and assert our proper place in it, whether we're in Halifax, Fogo Island, or Miramichi. And so I think that's an important part of it. I think, in Atlantic Canada, I think COA does a fantastic job. I think they understand business. I think we've not yet hit on what is that right architecture that puts more of the agency and more of the tools and processes inside the community so they can be more self-driving. I think that part is absolutely missing. And, we talk about what is the problems we're trying to solve. I think we need to look more closely at money, how it comes in and how it leaves. Not every business is created the same. A business that exists that basically sucks money out, that is a different kind of a business than a business that is locally owned and keeps the money in. So I think we need better tools around tracking. Like, we should know for every community, what is its gross domestic income? Those are harder figures to come by. I think there's a policy place for government to help us develop those metrics.
That's great. Now, I've taken up a lot of your time already, and so I think this will be the final question. I'd like to ask it to all of you. Maybe, Alex, I'll start with you. I was struck from in Premier King's remarks, if there was one word that reappeared frequently, it was the word opportunity. And it's a bit hard to think about opportunity in the moment we find ourselves in. Most of us are locked up in some way, shape, or form. Alex, can you just talk about what you think the opportunities are in your work for the region, for community-based economic development as we slowly transition out of the immediate crisis from COVID-19? And I'll ask that question to each of you. What are the big opportunities for the region, for your communities as we look ahead?
Also, another big question. I think the opportunity is around connecting and defining where we are right now. I guess the engagement is the opportunity, I think, right now at this moment. And in New Brunswick, we've just recently, we're halfway through a series of virtual conferences and podcast discussions with New Brunswickers called Turning Point. And each installment in the 8-part series is looking at what are those challenges, what are the problems we want to solve, to Zita's point, around our labor market, around our economy, around our demographics, our fiscal realities, and where are the opportunities around entrepreneurship, strategic sectors, around social sectors. So we're really looking at kind of defining what those opportunities are at this stage. I think it may be a bit premature for us to say exactly right now what the opportunity is, not knowing where things are going to lead globally, not knowing kind of how long this is going to last. But I think Zita's made excellent points about asset-based community development. I think we need to be kind of taking that lens of what are the assets we have in our province, in our communities, and giving communities the capacity to develop those assets. And I think that's the other piece that she's also touched on. So excellent point, Zita. The Turning Point series is still underway. Actually, I'm missing our 4th episode for this morning, but I'm looking forward to kind of reconnecting and catching up. If people are interested in following along with this provincial conversation in New Brunswick about where the turning points are, what are the problems we want to solve, where are the opportunities, just visit turningpointnb.ca, and that's ongoing for the next 3 weeks.
Thank you, Alex. Annika, do you want to share your thoughts on opportunities for the region, for your community?
Sure, I'm just going to give a quick example. So when the shutdowns for COVID started, I was brought in to help coordinate a program that's supported by the Department of Business provincially and working in partnership with the Department of Education. And the idea was to get meals to kids who would have benefited from food through their school breakfast programs who weren't getting it anymore while schools were closed. And using a locally developed online ordering app and having meals prepared and delivered from local restaurants. And so that program started in a few pilot sites and has been expanded, and to date we've delivered over 21,000 meals. And I think that it's an example because it really helps to look at how we can close this gap between thinking about addressing social issues and helping to support the local economy and using technology in the process. And so I think if we start to take that kind of asset-based lens, looking around at like who's here, we were able to keep people employed that would have had to go on unemployment otherwise. And so it's like let's shift how we're thinking about the infrastructure and the assets that we already have and come up with new ideas for addressing the problems.
That's great. Geoffrey?
For us, I guess the pandemic has really forced us to rethink the way we do our public engagement. So we were, as a community, almost at the town crier kind of level of engagement, where the old hear ye in the park. We used very traditional media, whether it was the newspaper for public announcements, and it kind of allowed us to experiment with some technology to comply with what we're required to do as a municipality under the Local Governance Act. So we have to have our meetings public, but when you have to close your doors for fear of transmission, it really forces us to try to create an environment that allowed the public to still know that the meetings are taking place and that they're being done in a transparent way. But we needed to rethink how that worked. The other opportunity around that was there wasn't a lot of people in this community, being slightly rural, that had that tech-based. So there was a lot of trial and error. I'll be honest with you. I became a tech expert overnight. I don't have my certificate from any school, but I will be putting it on any resume that if I do decide for another career opportunity. But it really forced us to use our skill sets and find solutions to problems that we didn't know were ever going to exist. And I think it hopefully, again, one of those things that aren't going to change is that we continue to engage our public, because studies have shown that using technology is a way to reach that younger demographic, which we seem to miss when we're trying to engage. And hopefully this will allow them to engage with us in a way that they're comfortable with.
That's fantastic. Zita, you started us off, and you get a chance to close our conversation today.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, I think if I could sum up all the things we've been saying is we all want to work toward creating more coherent expressions of communities so they can act in their own interests more effectively. That starts with understanding and developing assets. I think if I was to say for Atlantic Canadians, I mean, the whole concept of being an Atlantic Canadian is a funny thing. Like, I don't know if anybody, if you ran into them in Beijing, would say I'm from Atlantic Canada. I think they might say I'm from Nova Scotia or Newfoundland or New Brunswick or PEI. But so I think there's some really big opportunities for us to come together and to try and understand what that means. In terms of opportunities, aside from all of the asset-based development work that I think we can do and lead in terms of industries, I think two that resonate with all of us. One is this so-called blue economy, or the oceans economy. We have an immense set of opportunities there. We're off to a good start with the ocean supercluster. I don't think most of us in Atlantic Canada even understand what that is, let alone understand how we can help it or be a part of it. So I think that's a whole conversation we need to have. And I think tourism, the one thing that's happened as a result, many things have happened, but one thing that's happened as a result of COVID has been that what is the future of tourism? I spend a lot of time in these kinds of conversations locally and globally. For sure, tourism was in trouble with mass tourism. And I think we have had a very immature understanding as Atlantic Canadians, you know, what is tourism? What is the potential of it to actually support cultural assets? We haven't always gotten the scale right. If you want to talk about sustainable tourism, there are two requirements. Number one is the scale has to be appropriate to the size of the community. And the second is it can't be your only industry. Otherwise, you're going to have your grandparents out selling trinkets on the corner. And so how to do tourism development that is community-based, that really lines up with the future that the whole industry around the world is looking for, which is deeper, richer, fewer trips, stay longer. So what is it we can do together that helps Atlantic Canada develop properly our tourism assets? I mean, it doesn't mean we have to put a Holiday Inn Express and a cruise ship coming into every community, because that's kind of a culture killer. So let's develop intelligently the tourism assets we have, which are many, and let's figure out how someone can come to Atlantic Canada and spend time and get from, you know, from Geoffrey to Alex to Annika to Fogo Island and, you know, all around the circle. That doesn't exist. I think there's a lot of opportunities there.
Great. Well, I just want to thank each of you for participating in today's discussion and for your leadership in your communities. This has been one of the more informative and inspiring conversations I've been a part of over the past several months. So thank you very much for taking the time and sharing your insights. And on behalf of the Public Policy Forum, I want to thank everyone for joining Atlantic Summit 2020. Thank you to the Government of Canada for supporting the Atlantic Summit and the Atlantic Revitalization Project. Happening right after the panel, the Atlantic Summit 2020 virtual cocktail to meet speakers and other conference attendees in an informal virtual setting. Not quite perfect community, but the best we have today. So just like your conference hallway run-in, the cocktail session is hosted by Executive Vice President of External Relations at the Public Policy Forum, Julie Cathley. Atlantic Summit's second episode of Lightning Talks on Employer Outlook and Supporting Adaptation is now released on the Summit's conference page. And thank you once again for attending and participating in today's conversation and for your interest in the work of the Public Policy Forum. Thank you.